Welcome to Brown Bag Lit. We're so happy to see you here today. My name is Chloe Elena Miller. Shasta Grant and I founded Brown Bag Lit in January 2023, and today we're really happy to welcome you here today to hear Charlotte Taylor Fryar, the author of Potomac Fever, in conversation with Ethelbert Miller. And Charlotte will be discussing her essays in Potomac Fever and how she used historical research and environmental observation to write the book through questions from Ethelbert. And we think this will be a really great interest to those of you who are writers here today listening, interested in history, nature, the river, and our nation's capital. Congratulations to Charlotte, not only on your book, but also for being chosen to be the Inner Loop's Author's Corner Spotlight author for the month. In a moment, I'll turn it over to the Inner Loop so you can learn more about this amazing DC-based literary community as well. First, I wanted to share a little bit more about Brown Bag Lit. We host free monthly events online like this one. You can find our schedule online. I'll put all the links into the chat, including our YouTube, where you can find recordings from earlier events and how to follow us on social media. All of our readings are free. We really encourage you to buy our authors' books and consider leaving us a tip to help pay for our expenses. You can use the Buy Me a Coffee, which is where you registered for this program. On Wednesdays this year, which is changing to Tuesdays in 2026, we're hosting an ongoing accountability writing group, Lunch Break Writers. Membership is rolling, and you're welcome to join anytime. In addition to our weekly meetings, we host special small group events around literary topics, social hours, and more. Next month, we'll be hosting editor and publisher Jonah Colson for a small group discussion just for Lunch Break Writers about editing and publishing an anthology. For today, please make sure that you stay muted during our conversation. I recommend you put the screen on speaker view during the reading and then gallery view for the Q&A. You can put questions for our guests into the chat. We'll open that up at about 12:45. And now I'd like to turn it over to Abby Newhouse from the Inner Loop. Thank you, Abby and the Inner Loop, for helping to organize and present today's feature.
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, we're super excited to work with Brown Bag this year. And it's good to see you all. Yeah, I guess we saw a couple people from outside of DC in the chat. So sorry that we are a DC-based literary nonprofit. But if you're ever in the area, feel free to come to one of our events. We host monthly readings where we have featured writers along with just kind of anyone who is willing to read from their nonfiction, fiction, poetry, whatever type of work. Really fun events. We also host writing retreats out in the Kakapen Mountains in West Virginia. We do a residency program, partnering with Woodlawn Pope Leahy House down in Alexandria, Virginia, and then also the Authors Corner program, which is what we're doing today. Charlotte Taylor Fryar is our November spotlight, and our Authors Corner program aims to give authors who were published with small to medium-sized presses the type of marketing that they deserve, to get their books into local bookstores, to get them at events so that everybody can just learn more about their amazing work. Charlotte's is really taking off here, especially in DC. I feel like it's on like the bestseller list at some of our local bookstores, and it's a wonderful, wonderful work. And we're so excited that she gets to talk with Ethelbert Miller, the Ethelbert Miller. He's a board member for the Inner Loop as well. So it's been wonderful to work with him over the years. And I know they're going to have a wonderful conversation today. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Charlotte. Good to talk to you.
You
And
as well.
the first question I want to ask you, what are the spiritual rewards that come from writing about nature and the outdoors? What have you learned from the trees and rivers?
Oh, Ethelbert, an easy one first, huh? No, little softball. How did you come to write this book? Let's go. Um, Listen, as I have been taking this book around DC, um, one of the questions that I do often get asked is like, what's the biggest surprise you've learned in writing this book? And I think it's a common question for lots of writers. And I think the first time I was asked it, I panicked and I gave a sort of facile answer. And I think when I've been asked it subsequently, I continue to give these sort of facile answers that are like these little nuggets of history. I'm like, oh, the thing that surprised me most was like in the research, just how much George Washington loved water grass as compost. just things that are silly. I don't know. There's two rare species of freshwater crustaceans that live in Rock Creek Park and nowhere else. And how fascinating for this. And I think I have given some of these, again, more facile answers, which are interesting to me. Like I could talk about George Washington and his great love of watergrass as compost, and he had a whole idea and plan about it, whatever. But I think like the most surprising thing, and to really answer your question, is like in writing the book, but more so in it's almost like the decision to write this book and to like dedicate myself to a project that would put me in relationship deeply with the Potomac. It's like this knowledge that is somehow deeper than belief that like I am, you are, Chloe and Shasta and Abby, everyone who lives in this Washington, D.C. area, like is the river. And for for poets like yourself, potentially like saying like I am the river, maybe this feels easy, but I think for me, coming from man, I came to this book from academia and from being a historian.
Mhm.
I think the idea of saying like, no, I really am the Potomac, and this isn't just a thing I'm saying, like I know it to be true.
Well, let
That
me ask
I
you this question,
yeah,
Sean. Before coming to DC, you lived in North Carolina.
true.
Was there any river in North Carolina, like Cape Fear River, Roanoke River, that you felt that it had a history and mystery and you heard people
Hmm.
talking about?
No rivers, but certainly like the landscape itself. There's no one, people have asked me this before. My parents have asked me this. There's no one body of water back home in North Carolina that like imprinted itself on me like the Potomac has.
Mm,
I grew up on a tributary of the Yadkin River called charmingly Muddy Creek, and that is the only body of water that ever really emerges to the front of my mind as like something that deeply flowed into me in the
mm,
way that the Potomac did. Um, and yet, that said, I think there are experiences I had as like a young person growing up in North Carolina, simply being outside. It wasn't like it does not feel, even now with my adult eyes, like it was some kind of deep practice or devotion. It's the same kind of childlike, or I was a teenager really, spending time outside that gave me a love simply for being outside. And then
mhm,
later as an adult, I feel like that practice deepened in
mm.
various ways.
How important is it in terms of keeping a journal when you're discovering the outside space and place?
Um, I think it is critical to practice, to answer it very shortly and simply. Um, I've told this story before, but I think it's a useful one. My students so rarely believe me when I tell them I started writing Potomac Fever, and I did not know that I was writing a book, because it did begin as a series of sort of journals. At the time I was writing, I had just moved to DC. I was still in graduate school at the University of North Carolina. I'm working on my dissertation. It's about something totally different. And to kind of get started, jump started each morning writing on what I thought was my real work, my
Mm,
dissertation, right? I'd go out for a walk along the river, take my dog, and I'd make a ton of notes, journal, if you will. I was using the Notes app on my phone at the time and taking pictures, but this too is a kind of journaling of what I would see. And then I would come home, pull up a Google Doc, start just kind of typing it up. It's like, yeah, I just sort of like let my fingers start flying. And then, like, once I was like, all right, I'm flowing, I'm going, let's go, let's go. I'd pull up the next Google Doc, which was my dissertation, and like actually start writing.
mm,
And I think there was a way in which I was taking notes and paying attention to the world around me, which was the Potomac in DC. And in so doing, I think that allowed me to write this other project that was very meaningful to me. And yet, by the time I had finished, my dissertation, my real work, I also had 200 something pages of journal about
mm.
all the plants and history and birds
Well,
and
you
my
well you
own
do
thoughts
you
and
do something
feelings.
that's fascinating in terms of your writing, and I think this is one of the strengths of the book. You bring all the senses in. I've got a sense of seeing what you're seeing. I get a sense of touch, taste, smell. Everything is coming in on one page after another. And how difficult is it to sustain that?
I think for me, not like that does feel to me like a primary mode of writing. And I think for me, like this semester, I'm teaching an environmental writing class, and I have students do that exercise like over and over again. I was just saying earlier, like I'll at 1:05, I have to run to go teach environmental writing. And my students, for probably the nth time this semester, are going to do an exercise asking to do that kind of sensory writing. How to sustain it over time to me feels like it's like our constant process of discovery. One of the things I am often thinking about, particularly this year, is sort of like micro seasons along the Potomac and trying to sort of pinpoint when does when in the fall does the shift from cicada to cricket happen?
Mm,
When is the peak stink of rotting pawpaws along the Potomac? And when does it start to, decrease a little with the frost?
mm,
Um, when does the river really begin to have that like high tide, uh, the correct word is stank, just like that, ugh, fills your nose and you love it, but you hate it. Um, Identifying those kind of sensory details around when they happen seasonally, I find a very grounding practice,
mm,
and therefore maybe not terribly hard to um, sustain over time. But I think selecting the right details to
mm,
evoke the experience of something does really matter. And that to me feels like difficult.
mm. Talk about Rachel Carson's connection to the area, and what can we learn from her life and work?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rachel Carson, she's from Pennsylvania, and her true love place on this earth was Maine, the coast of Maine. But she lived for so many years in and around Silver Spring, or really that sort of corner of like upper Montgomery County. And she lived here for the proximity to her job. And in that way, I feel like she's like so many people in DC, right? She moved here for a job that could help sustain her family.
Mm,
Um, and this is where she was living here when she wrote Silent Spring. And prior to writing Silent Spring, she had really been like a beloved nature writer. She wrote this trilogy of books about the sea, and oh my God, talk about sensory writing. My God, like she immerses you in every way in the ocean in those books. Gloriously. They're beautiful, and they were bestsellers because they inspired this deep, deep love for the oceans. But these are not polemics. She's
mhm,
just these are nature books that are like, did you know? And so when she turned to writing Silent Spring, I think for people even in her own life, this book that describes how the use of DDT is poisoning slowly the world. Um, I think even for her friends and people around her, they were like, "Why can't you go back to writing those sweet nature books, Rachel?"
mhm,
And she couldn't. Now that said, she lived in Silver Spring, which at the time she was living there in the late 50s and early 60s was a almost totally segregated neighborhood. And those of you who have read, Silent Spring or know the legacy of her work, which is tremendous, I should say, you'll remember that Silent Spring, even in the title, it describes
mhm,
not, the poisoning necessarily of people who are using DDT, um, but of a silent spring of dead birds. And she talks about in Silent Spring, like how she imagines the decay of the suburbs.
mm,
And she's imagining, and I think that she's talking about what it would be like for a place like Silver Spring, these white suburbs around DC in the 50s and 60s, sundown towns even, what it would be like for them to lose their kind of natural surroundings and to
mm,
lose the beauty and power of nature around them. Something that, yes, nobody wants to happen. And yet, in her focus on this, which she believed would be most effective in persuading the people she wanted to persuade, people who work in government, who could change laws. She needed to speak perhaps to white suburbanites like herself. And again, like Rachel Carson, to my mind, is one of the great literary activists there are.
Mm.
I think I know I write in the book somewhere, like, I really do believe that every person on this earth owes whatever piece of health they have to her. Because I do think without her kind of writing, it would have taken decades for the effects, for people to wake up to the effects of DDT trickling into the rest of the world to take place.
Mm.
And yet, I also think we need to think about her legacy here in DC as someone who chose, number one, perhaps not to write about race and to not write about the effects of these poisons on her focus is really on suburban spaces and suburbanites and the despoilment of nature. And in that, she rarely includes people within that form of nature. And so I
Mm.
always want to claim her for DC. She wrote it here. She wrote it in the suburbs, but come on, she wrote it
Yeah.
here. And but still acknowledge that other part of her
Mm.
legacy and history too.
Mhm.
Thanks for asking that. It's a good
Right.
one.
How do you, as a white Southerner, how do you navigate the river of race? And are
Mhm.
there do's and don'ts when you think about writing about race?
Another nice little softball. Ethelbert, I think about it often, but I also think that it's been foundational, I think, to my training as a historian. I was really lucky enough to come up as a writer in this place called the Center for the Study of the American South, which is at the University of North Carolina. And this is a place that was founded in I think the 90s, so explicitly to study the multiplicity of Souths and plural Souths. And as part of that, I feel like in thinking about South and thinking about Southern writing, thinking about Southern environmental writing, critical to that has been, seriously, since I was like an 18-year-old, like rolling up to college for my first sort of American studies, Southern studies classes, was this close study of how Southerners of all races have navigated, as you say, the river of race. I had a friend recently who used this really, I thought, helpful term, and I'll offer it. This is my friend Moa Short, who is from Georgia. She's a white Georgian, and she used this word, emotional trespass, to talk about the feeling that I think perhaps is critical for white Southerners, but I think all white American writers to be aware of when you can feel yourself moving towards territory perhaps you should not occupy, or territory you need to just think about more in your writing. Um, and I found that to be a helpful term, emotional trespass, because to trespass, it's almost like it's almost like in a biblical sense, right? In like a Lord's Prayer kind of thing. Or is that the Lord's Prayer? Anyway, um, because it I don't mean like trespass into to land, but it's more like that sense of territory that doesn't belong to you. And I think being attuned to that is critical. And at this point, I almost wish I could give that kind of like clear, this is how you can do it, and this is how you can avoid it.
Mm.
But I think it is a skill to be learned through listening, um, almost exclusively, but at the same time, you also have to practice
Right.
and you make mistakes as well.
Mm. Let me quote you. This is from page 55. And you write, an integral part of being white in nature is the expectation that once there, one can be free of an awareness of one's racial identity and associated privileges. And my question is, but what about black people or non-white people in nature? Are we trapped because we are not an integral part of nature?
Oh gosh, not at all. I think in that quote, I'm really trying to identify this feeling deep in the white American psyche that nature belongs to us. And um, one of the classes I teach here is American Studies. And we read, one of the earliest things we read in this class is, I can't believe I'm quoting this, John Winthrop's A City on a Hill speech. It's from like 1630. Um, and in this speech, John Winthrop, who was the first president of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he talks about how the Puritans are going to set up this colony and they will be an example to the world. And therefore, God gives them the right to use and take this land in order to make that good example. And I'm quoting and I'm thinking about it because it feels to me a clear example of the way in which white colonists have occupied American land and American soil as almost permanent terra nullius, this idea of like, there's no one here and it's ours for the taking. And the section you just quoted, like what I'm trying to describe there is, I think, one way in which white Americans have dealt with that history of trespass and of treating American land as if there was no one here. And of course there is. But I think for some white Americans, the idea that you can enter nature, something that's different from city, some place that feels freed from history, which is to say human history, you can enter that place and not have to think about race. That to me feels like foundational to a white American experience. And
Well, yeah,
here
you
too, I'm
mentioned that.
thinking,
I'm glad you said that because you mentioned in your book, Potomac Fever, you write that when you are in nature, you can forget that you're white. You mentioned that, and I said, well, this made me think of Harriet Tubman, also from
yes.
the area of Maryland. I'm saying when she looks at a tree, she's probably reminded that she is black and she's looking for safety. So it's a completely different way
Mhm.
that Harriet Tubman might look at it, and it has nothing to do with the difference in years. But I just felt that has something is going on in terms of how a black person views. Let me bring something in to give you an example.
Sure.
Your work led me to a poem by my friend Cornelius Eady. And this is
Mhm.
Cornelius Eady. The poem is called Success. Very short. Success. I will stop dreaming now. Now that I finally made it. Outside I can hear the wind rustling through the leaves of trees. I own those trees. And that's a complete thing. That's black ownership, you know. And I
Yes.
said that, he's not looking at a tree like, okay, all of a sudden I see the sycamore and I think of a lynching. No, I own these trees. And I said, well, that's something that is very, very important in terms of when if I look at your book critically, it seems that sometimes you're talking about white people and black people, but you're able to see white individuals, but you see black people as a group.
Hmm. I think this is a fair critique. And thank you for offering it. Um, I will, I guess, offer in response, and thank you for reading this poem. Um, I will offer, I think, in response that it is a book that is written from my own perspective.
Mhm.
And, I think as I intimated before, it began, I think, as like, my journal and my experiences. Um, and there is another version of this book that is far more focused on other people, I think, outside of myself and my perspective. Um, but it is perhaps not new what you have said, but I appreciate you saying it.
Mm. Let's go back to something that happened yesterday. PBS, since it's still around. Ken Burns has his documentary about the American Revolution. What I felt is very important about your book is that we think about George Washington in terms of as a general and helping us get our independence. But you talk about George Washington as a surveyor and how George Washington is so associated with this land, and that has a lot to do with him wanting the capital to be here. Could you talk about that?
Sure.
Since Ken Burns is not here.
Sure. Um, yes. So, it's in the name of the city that this place is so deterministic of this one man's legacy and his great, I always want to be careful with this word, but I think it has to do with his great love for the Potomac River, but that love, I think, is premised on the potentials for making money. So as a young man, George Washington, grew up here along the Potomac. And as a young man, he was sent out to survey, right? Make a, sense and map of the land, and in so doing, claim ownership over it for potential, real estate speculators, investors. And as part of that, he traveled very far up west of the river. And I think this is when he's in his very early 20s. This is why I always want to be careful with this word, but I really do think from his journals and from his notes, he really, really fell in love with the river and its potential tied to the development of a new nation. Um, and so when it is after the war, after the American Revolution, and he is almost ready to retire, and yet he is then called upon to be president. Part of his perhaps goal as president is to do two things. He really does want to make the Potomac the center of the nation. And to do that, he wants to do two things. So here are the two things. He wants to place the capital on the banks of the Potomac, his river that he does love. And he wants to create a trade network up the river into the Western territories, which was very much at that time thought of as the future of America. But premised in this is tying together, the political future of the country to the economic future of the country. And that feels to me critical in thinking about why this man loved the Potomac so much. Like I said, he really loved this river. He wrote about it constantly. But that economic future, because it's in the South between Virginia and Maryland, is premised on the continued expansion and development of slavery in the region. And so I think for him and for his legacy in DC, our city carries his name. It's important to remember and think about our city as a place that was established and placed here in order to continue to deepen the sort of political future of the United States with this institution of slavery.
Let's talk about this river as in terms of boundaries. And this gets back to you being from North Carolina before you come here to
Okay.
Washington. Many times when you're traveling the South, you have a sense where when you're crossing the railroad tracks. Right. So,
Yep.
I'm looking at how railroad tracks have a division, and then also how rivers have a division. Any connection there?
I think absolutely. Eudora Welty, great Southern writer, she's from Mississippi. And I remember in her memoir, she talks about visiting some family members in the North, which for her could have been like Kentucky. But she talked about this sort of feeling when she would exit from the South into the North when they would be driving up to the North. And she talks about how it's a border that you can feel. And I think for me, and I think for others I've spoken to as well, the Potomac can often feel like a very literal boundary. But in some ways, it's like a psychic boundary too. And the Potomac is one boundary, but there are others. The Anacostia is, of course, one of the harder boundaries in the city between, the area east of the river, as people sometimes call it, and the rest of the city. And Rock Creek also forms another, I would offer, sort of psychic boundary of understanding and relationship to the city. And then there are many creeks that are buried under the city that also form, I think, these kind of psychic boundaries of place. I would offer it still means something to live east of Georgia Avenue versus west of Georgia Avenue or 14th Street. There are all kinds of boundaries that are made up in the city. But they are also, this is to, I think, your earlier point, they feel specific to the individual. I think, like I myself, I live on the other side of the city from the Anacostia River, but I used to live closer to there. And I remember perhaps that feeling of what it is to cross over the bridges, right, across the Anacostia to enter into Ward 7 from the ward across the way, and vice versa. And this feels to me particular to the individual, which one of those rivers or railroad tracks, if you will, right, feels specific to that experience of making and breaking lines as you travel certain areas of division across the city.
Let's keep the Eudora Welty connection going for a minute,
Sure.
and talk about you as Shaw, as a photographer.
Mm.
What do you like to capture?
Yeah, I guess she was a photographer during the Depression, the
Well,
WPA.
and might be in the depression right now.
Yeah. Ethelbert. Um, Too true. I do. One of the essays in here is about, it's called Swimming. And it starts with, I don't know, it just became sort of a habit to take photographs when I would be out along the river. And studying, for me, up close at least, some of the plants. And so initially, like, I think my photography, I would hate to show it to anyone. Eudora Welty, if I may offer, I feel like she was not like a great photographer. She was okay, but like you don't want to see my photographs at first, right? They're like little up close pictures of a certain kind of leaf so I can identify it
Well, at
later.
least in that selfies.
Yeah, that's true. Um, but yeah, um, I think lots of plant photographs trying to do IDs, but I also, as I began sort of taking more photographs, this wasn't a practice that I had really beforehand. Um, I started looking at historic photographs of Washington, D.C. Uh, this will feel like maybe an abrupt change, but this weekend I was at the National Gallery of Art, and they have a really fabulous exhibit on photography in the Black arts movement. And there are some incredible photographs taken by not Addison Scurlock, but I suppose his son, George Scurlock, and they were a Black studio photography in DC for many years. And then so I started looking at a number of photographs here, photographs taken by Black photographers in the city of, yeah, thank you for adding the link, Chloe.
Mhm.
It's a great exhibit. Started looking, I think, at two groups of photographs. Number one was sort of like Potomac River photographs. There's large collections in the Library of Congress of folks enjoying the river. And I would look at these photographs. They're often of white Washingtonians, particularly along the tidal basin, other areas along the river. And I would almost try to find those places along the river. And then I would do, in some cases, almost like reef photography. It's not like I would position people there, but I would try to find the sort of spot, the angle of the landscape, the topography, and take that photograph. And in so doing, to answer your question, I began to develop, I think, a habit of more like landscape photography.
Mhm.
And this isn't like with a fine camera, this is on my little iPhone. Um, but as I began to think more about who is absent from these photographs, I started looking more at the Scurlock studio photographs, and um, obviously Gordon Parks has so many wonderful photographs of DC as he visited over the years, and think about how their contributions to this, what feels, I don't know, it helped me understand how photography has documented, I think, a culture of recreation in the city and determined who participates in what forms of recreation and pleasure. And I listen, I still take lots of photographs through the city. And I always love seeing historic photographs of the
Mhm.
city during certain time periods because it helps me. To me, photography feels like one of the um, clearest ways that I can better access sort of the layers that add up in place there.
Mhm.
Um,
You
Yeah,
know, one of the things when we look at photography, we get this changing city. Throughout your book, you make quite a number of comments about gentrification.
sure.
And I thought to myself, there's one person I remember growing up in this city. I remember when he was small, but I think when I think of gentrification, I think of him, and that's Jair Lynch, who's African American. You know,
Hmm.
who when you see that you talk about developers, he's like one of the major developers
Yeah.
in the area. I mean, when you look at I think the Meridian Hill, used to be the dorm there for Howard. I think he might have even
Hmm.
had the Macmillan. So this whole thing of looking at developers, sometimes we have to look at the sense of race in terms of blacks that are very active in terms of trying to redesign the city.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the well, I'll be direct. I think one of the critiques I think I have of my own book, you write it, I wrote it 5 years ago, and you learn things over the time. I think one of the critiques I have of my own book is that I, in certain chapters, draw the line really sharply and say white, black. But I think a more nuanced look would have offered what I feel like you're getting at in there, which is that it's not as clear as it's never as clear as simply white desire for cheap housing, and a desire to perhaps push Black residents out of the city. There are so many forces, the desires of developers, certainly, in
Mhm.
helping shape the changes in the city. And of course, gentrification is a word that, at least to my mind, can often have tremendously negative consequences. Like you say gentrification and people's like noses crinkle up, right?
Mhm.
But there can be other descriptions and terms for, I don't know exactly how to say it, right? There
Well,
are
let's look at something that you do say.
Yeah,
This is on page 61. You
okay.
talk about being out in nature, and you say you have this joy in terms of beginning to name things. Okay,
Hmm.
about this naming, and it said, I felt that this response to nature captured the power of renaming things, and now I've started bringing in the people that you begin to talk about very early in your book, and that's the indigenous people. That these
Sure.
places have names, but you write in your book like I like giving names to things, and I felt that that might be white privilege, that might be a power that you say, okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to look at this and call this the Americas, and so I'm just looking at that whole thing, the power of naming, and how when I'm reading, you have a pleasure that the nature is giving to you. It's almost like, for example, if I'm young, I will, as a child, give names to things because it's pleasure that I'm enjoying. And I felt that I didn't want to be too critical of you in terms of the naming because you're enjoying the nature. And it's okay, I love this. This reminds me of such and such. But then the power of naming, when we look at issues of race and indigenous people,
Hmm.
that becomes political.
Hmm. I mean, I agree with you. I think you're talking about sort of the section that where I'm talking about like learning the names of
Right.
plants.
Hmm.
And I agree with you. Um, I think there's also like I think a history of sort of white um, or European settlers in coming to the Americas. They would bring over, names from England
Like New
to
England.
yeah, oh my God, perfect. Yeah. But also would apply them to like animals and plants. And so some of the North American, Native American plants and animals we have, we call them by these European names. And in many cases, they're not terribly descriptive. I mean, like they're descriptive in that they kind of help. I'm thinking of like bluebird or wood duck. These are also, European names for certain birds, but they're different species. And I certainly agree with you too that there is much difficulty in the power and pleasure of naming things. There's also, I would offer, a lot of pleasure in not knowing, um, and simply sitting in the case specifically of plants. Uh, there is a lot of pleasure too in sitting with a certain plant and not knowing what it's called and trying to understand it on its own terms. Where does it like to live? Who does it like to live nearby? Um, without rushing to the book to be able to say, oh, it's a blah, blah, blah. And I I think that the section that you read, like I described that kind of frenzy to name as like a desire to know. I've got to be able to master it all.
Mhm.
And over time, that feels to me less important.
Mhm. Well, let's talk about something that is important. This will be my last question. And that has a lot to do with the times that we're living in, especially when it comes to climate change and also the environmental protection of, say, the river. Where do you see things happening right now? Because there's a lot of deregulations. There's, agencies that would be responsible for protecting our environment that are being
Mhm.
dismantled.
I think this is all, yeah, this is all true. And I wish at this point I could offer some kind of
Well, you've offered the
helpful,
book. The book is
yeah.
that's why the book should be required reading because it tells you, that gives you the history. It tells you how fascinated you are by it. And it's sort of like saying, like 50 years from now, somebody should have the same joy of walking where you walked.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I will offer this. There are many organizations that, do water quality work and study the river. The Potomac River Keeper Network, the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, and I see Renee, by the way, who's from the ICPRB here in the chat, um, and the Potomac Conservancy. And the Potomac Conservancy every year does sort of a holistic study of the condition of the river, how things are going. And this, I think, is the fifth year in a row that they always give it a grade, like, did you pass, basically? Are you healthy? And this is the fifth year in a row that the Potomac Conservancy has awarded the Potomac River a B, which basically means like care and like upkeep of the river is like flatlined. And listen, I mean, it's certainly better than it declining in health, but at the same time, even though there are successes that this organization measures, far more land, particularly in the upper Potomac River Valley, is conserved, excuse me. There are still so many, there are still so many threats to water quality and development, quite frankly, closer to the city. Um, and I I don't know, Ethelbert, if I can offer the like, but here's how you can change things and get involved, except I will offer to support these organizations, which are being defunded.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's a good
and
way of us just opening it up for questions that
yeah,
people may have for you.
absolutely. Yeah, other folks who have questions, happy to answer any questions.
You can put your questions directly into the chat, or you can raise the little yellow Zoom hand. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but I know we have a lot of writers in the room. Charlotte, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you took the research and the great historical knowledge that you have and worked that into a book that's easily accessed and read by a larger non-academic audience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, listen, my editor is on this call, so like I did it through Laura Hart of Bellevue Literary Press. And I really mean it. Um, my like professional background is kind of dual. I'm a historian, trained as a historian, but I'm also an herbalist and I work with plants. And I think for a long time, those two threads, I could see ways in which they felt connected. And yet I really struggled to be able to tie these things together. Um, like in my own day-to-day life, it made a ton of sense to me, but I think I could struggle to put it down on paper. Um, but also in so doing, I think that was like the great reward of writing this book and the thing that has been as meaningful, to me as possible. But I also will end by saying having an editor that could help me piece together again what at times felt like not just two but three separate books, various histories of the city, you know, doc, sort of naturalist observation, and then maybe personal narrative too, my relationship to the city. Um, those three things at times could feel separate, but having somebody else work with me to sort of intertwine them, I think was critical.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question, Chloe?
Yeah, that's really great. And I think it also
Hmm.
answers, I see Caroline has put into the chat, If you had to give an overview of what the book is about, what would it be? If you wanted to add more to that. And I see that Serena from the ICPRB, the Interstate Commission on the Potomac
Uh-huh.
Basin, shared some information in the chat, so you guys can click on the link for more. Katie, I see you have a question. Would you like to unmute and ask?
I was just trying to be quiet in the chat, but thank you so much for this conversation. I'm an American studies person as well, and a creative writer. So I just learned recently about plant humanities as an academic field, and I'm really interested in seeing how I can connect it to my work in African American history and culture around the Great Migration. So I wondered if either of you all had any thoughts or knowledge about plant humanities.
Plant humanities.
Yeah, listen, I don't like the short answer, Katie, is like no. I've heard about it. Um, I like scrolled through some journal articles, but I too am excited to learn a little bit more about plant humanities and really literally everything you just said. My like eyebrows were like,
When you
so
say that,
we
it's
should
sort of,
chat.
it reminds me of, the history of George Washington Carver,
Yeah.
and his importance in terms of his life and even his paintings, his drawing, sketches, his
Hmm.
artwork is of botanical. What I think that would be an interesting person. And then the woman who just did the book on Harriet Tubman, where
Hmm.
she's really looking at the whole countryside of Maryland, in terms of this is how Harriet Tubman was able to identify plants and trees and things of that sort. And
Hmm.
I find that there are a number of writers who are writing biography. I'm thinking of Alexis Gumbs, who's wrote this book
Hmm.
about Audre Lorde, but he looks at Audre Lorde as a geologist, because Audre Lorde was into rocks and stuff. And I think what happens now, we're having scholars like maybe like yourself, like Katie and Charlotte, who are really now fleshing out and realizing that, okay, we have to bring certain disciplines into our studies, things that were not left out. It's very important for women to look at the sky a certain way, or river. I'm still looking at, Charlotte, how during the drought you're walking across the river and then you had to get back, but that whole experience, I think, is very helpful to somebody who is learning about something. It's not abstract. And I think when you talk about academic writing and journaling, that's what you want to bring those two together. And it's almost like saying, okay, how do I make the personal political and the political personal?
Hmm.
Thank you. I see that Jenny Yakovisi, who is of, I will give a shout out to the Washington Independent Review of Books and their upcoming conference. If you're in the area, I just put the link in the chat. Jenny asks for you, Charlotte, what are some of the primary research sources for the history of Washington, D.C. that you used?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, I think just as I was writing early drafts, man, I was just reading every secondary source I could get my hands on about DC. I feel so lucky, I guess, to be learning about Washington, D.C. history and coming to know more about it after the publication of this great, again, it's a kind of formal history. It's called Chocolate City, a history of race and democracy in the nation's capital. And what this book does and why I find it so helpful, and if this is kind of like recommending in a theology class like the Bible, but like it's a really helpful book that does like a a full sort of tallying of Washington D.C. history. From there, though, what I find so helpful about this book, it's by George Musgroves and
What's called that?
Musgrove and Ash. Um, what is really helpful, once you read it, great book. Yep, here it goes, Chris Ash. Um, what is so helpful about it is that they are meticulous researchers. And I think what I did in my very, very early sort of learning about the city's history, trying to understand more about what are the different neighborhoods, where am I, all of the most basic level questions, is go through their source materials and look at their primary sources.
And ignored what they did in terms of my if I was to die tomorrow,
Hmm.
the quote that I gave them in that book is that
Hmm.
about Chocolate City is that the ice cream melts.
Mm.
So when you talk about Chocolate City, the whole thing about melting, it was like a follow up to the Parliament song. But that was a thing that I guess you don't want to have your life reduced down. Like I remember Gwendolyn Brooks when she died, her whole
Hmm.
career was reduced down to one poem, "We Real Cool."
Mm.
So, I hope I had at least a literary career here in D.C. that doesn't must go reduce me down to one quote.
I I think so, Ethelbert,
Mm.
for
But
sure.
right, but I want to say this just a final thing.
Yeah,
I think that your book is excellent, Charlotte, and it's
thank you.
it's 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 something that should be definitely in the curriculum. This is the type of book that I think if I got in at high school, it could change my career, what I want to get involved in. I think, for example, this book should be given away free to anybody who's living by the river.
Mm.
And you look up, you might be able to encourage a number of people to become environmentalists, just because of what happened. Or just decide, okay, I'm going to clean up the river on the weekend, keep it clean.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
but I
Well,
think this
thank
is
you for
very
that.
important.
Thank you. I guess I'm thinking about the question too about like primary research sources. Um, One of my favorite things to do with my students each spring is to take them to the People's Archive, which is at the MLK library, in DC, the DC Public Library.
The
And
Washingtonian,
Mm.
the Washington
yeah,
collection.
yeah, of course. And I'm pausing here because I'm trying to like I'm trying to succinctly, concisely describe this archive, but like I can't. It's a treasure trove of Washington, DC history and culture. Um, and I take my students down there later in the year to check out these are my American Studies students, and we also, as part of that, study much of DC history too. We go down there to check out the Zine archive and learn a little bit more about history of punk in the 80s and 90s. They have a great time with that. I teach high school, so teenagers. They love analog things. Anything that isn't on their phones, they really do love. And um, anyway, that's one example of what is in the People's Archive. It is truly amazing. And if I had not yet written this book, and I would write it now, I would have spent way, way more time, I think, in that archive digging into more primary sources. So there's so much more to be explored and understood deeply that lives in that space. And so that to answer your question, what are some of my primary research sources? That's a place I wish I had spent more time as I was writing this.
That's a great resource. I put the link into the chat. If you don't mind, if I can go back to what you were saying about your editor and the writing process.
Sure.
We all dream for a great editor and publisher. And can you talk a little bit about how you found her or she found you or how that came together?
Yeah, I mean, it's very sweet to be saying this because, like I said, Laura's on the chat here. Um, but I think, at least from my experience, it felt like very charmed. Um, as I was finishing graduate school, um, I published my first really piece of creative nonfiction in the journal that my editor, Laura Hart, at Bellevue Literary Press, she had worked for as an undergraduate. And that was 2018, 2019. Um, and at that point, I think I had decided I wanted to write a book about the Potomac River. And I think I was bold enough to be like, in your bio, you write something like, she is at work on a book about blah, 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 even though, I mean, I didn't know what I just published my first essay, right? But she wrote and said, hey, if that's a thing that you're interested in doing, just like stay in touch. Um, and we did. And it took, again, how to say this concisely, but it did take a long time. And Laura was very generous in working with me on it sort of step by step. And starting probably from her first email / like probably was like an Instagram message Laura in like 2018, 19. I think I signed the contract for this book at the end of 2023. It really did, I think, in many ways feel like truly collaborative through that whole process. And that to me feels very, again, why I use the word charmed is that that does not often feel like something you get to do for a debut. And to have somebody really care for it. And if I can just use the soapbox while I got it to say how wonderful it was to work with Bellevue Literary Press. Thanks for dropping the link in the chat. Small press out of, Bellevue Hospital originally. And Laura can probably do a better job. It's her job, right? She can tell you all about it. But I will say this has been a really wonderful press to work with for a book like this that is multi-genre in many ways and has a group of readers and needs the support to reach them. It's not a wide net, right? This is a book. Of course, I want everyone in the world to read it, right? But Eugene, like, or Ethelbert, like, I want the people in DC to read it. And I want their criticisms and I want their responses because I think it can help people figure out, well, like, man, if you didn't do it right, like, here's what else needs to be said about the city. There's so much. They have been a wonderful press to work with to, I think, continue to help get it out into Washington, D.C., as has been, by the way, the Interloop, the folks who set this up.
Thank you. I love this community aspect around the book and all that there is to say and write and research and learn, continuing on forever and looking backwards and today. We're just about out of time. If both of you would like to share one last suggestion for us in the audience to read or write or work on, something else to look towards, I would love one last piece of advice.
Well, one of the books that I finished reading is Nicholas Boggs' book on James Baldwin, which is really important in terms of emphasizing his looking at his life in terms of his love relationships, and I think it's very insightful. There's been many books written about Baldwin because of the centennial that he came through, but I think that's very important. And then I would just say, looking forward to next year, there's two major centennials that are taking place along with the 250th anniversary of the country. Is this the 100th anniversary of Miles Davis, and also 100th anniversary of John Coltrane. So those are two major, African American musicians.
That's great. Ethelbert mentioned Harriet Tubman earlier, and I was thinking of maybe this was the book you were talking about. I'm not sure, but I was thinking about those books you read and they don't like immediately settle into you, but over time you think about them all the time. They're just like visiting your head and you're like, God, I gotta pull that out again. I gotta pull that out again. Okay, the book for me that I read, whenever it came out, it was over a year ago, was Tia Miles, great historian, this book called Wild Girls. And let me look up briefly what's the tagline here. Wild Girls, How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Challenged the Nation. And in this, she writes about different American women, for the most part, Harriet Tubman, Zit Kalasah, Grace Lee Boggs, Dolores Huerta, and Louise May Alcott of Little Women, and about how, like, what is the relationship between these women and the specificity of their environment. So when you were talking about how Harriet Tubman, it's like she learned how to make the owl calls of the barred owl to guide people right to safety. This is a terrific book that's short too. It's quite slim. It's not an academic tome, but yet it is deeply researched and deeply felt about the relationship between these women, so many of whom are activists, and in some ways deep organizers, right?
That Grace
And
Boggs, yeah.
yeah, and their relationship to the outdoors and their just their environments. So Wild Girls by Tia Miles.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.